it's rather dark, but hello, we are going to finish Esio Trot by Roald, and we are on page pretty sure it's 35. Yep, 35 with this picture. I had to let my phone cool down because I figured out that I was heating up, which makes sense because it's kind of warm today, and I'm reading in the car, so it can get kind of warm in here. But so page 35, we're just going to start, and there's no chapters, so this is just part 2 of 2. So Mrs. Silver had a part-time job. She worked from noon until 5 o'clock every weekday afternoon in a shop that sold newspapers and sweets. That made things a lot easier for Mr. Hoppy. So on the first exciting afternoon after he had made sure that Mrs. Silver had gone to work, Mr. Hoppy went out onto his balcony, armed with his long metal pole. He called this his tortoise catcher. He leaned over the balcony railings and lowered the pole down to Mrs. Silver's balcony below. Elfie was basking in the sunlight, the pale sunlight, over to one side. "Hello, Elfie." "Hello, Elfie," said Mr. Hoppy. "You are about to go for a little ride." He wiggled the tortoise catcher till it was right above Elfie. He pushed the hand lever so that the claws opened wide. Then he lowered the 2 claws neatly over Elfie's shell and pulled the lever. The claws closed tightly over the shell like 2 fingers of a hand. He hauled Elfie up onto his balcony. It was easy. So there must be some, you know how, some s'more things can, extend? It must be like that, because otherwise it'd be, bringing it down like that. You know? And then bringing it up, and then it's how do you you'd have to, bring it up. Anyway, I hope that makes sense. Mr. Hoppy weighed Elfie on his own kitchen scales, just to make sure that Mrs. Silver's figure of 13 ounces was correct. It was. Now, holding Elfie in one hand, he picked his way carefully through his huge collection of tortoises to find one that was first of all the same color shell as Elfie's, and secondly weighed exactly 2 ounces more. 2 ounces is not much. It is less than a smallish hen's egg weighs. But you see, the important thing is Mr. Hoppy's plan was to make sure that the new tortoise was bigger than Elfie, but only a tiny bit bigger. The difference had to be so small that Mrs. Silver wouldn't notice it. There's the picture. I hope you can see it. Okay. From his vast collection, it was not difficult for Mr. Hoppy to find just the tortoise he wanted. He wanted one that weighed 15 ounces exactly on his kitchen scales, no more and no less. When he had got it, he put it on the kitchen table beside Elfie, and even he could hardly tell that one was bigger than the other. But it was bigger. It was bigger by 2 ounces. This was tortoise number 2. Mr. Hoppy took tortoise number 2 out onto the balcony and gripped it with the claws of his tortoise catcher. Then he lowered it onto Mrs. Silver's balcony right beside a nice fresh lettuce leaf. Tortoise number 2 had never eaten a tender, juicy lettuce leaves before. It had never eaten tender, juicy lettuce leaves before. It had only had thick old cabbage leaves. It loved the lettuce and started chomping away at it with great gusto. There followed a rather nervous 2 hours' wait for Mrs. Silver to return from work. Would she see any difference between the new tortoise and Elfie? It was going to be a tense moment. Out on her balcony swept Mrs. Silver. "Elfie, my darling," she cried. "Mummy's back. Have you missed me?" Mr. Hoppy peering over his railing, but well hidden between 2 huge potted plants, held his breath. The new tortoise was still chomping away at the lettuce. My, Elfie, you do seem hungry today," Mrs. Silver was saying. "It must be Mr. Hoppy's magic words I've been whispering to you." Mr. Hoppy watched as Mrs. Silver picked the tortoise up and stroked his shell. Then she fished Mr. Hoppy's piece of paper out of her pocket, and holding the tortoise very close to her face, she whispered, reading from the paper, "Esio Trot, Esio Trot. Teg regam regab. Epoch no Esio Trot. Work po fuf po tos po nurks po. Oh, Oh, she's talking. Was Pulus på ugs Elsie fruits flug, tap not taff, Esio Trot, tap not taff. Teg no egg poke doof. This is the pictures from last page, by the way. And this is her holding the tortoise number 2 close to her face and whispering to him. Mr. Hoppy peered his head over the foliage and called out, "Good evening, Mrs. Silver. How is Elfie tonight?" "Oh, he's lovely," Mrs. Silver said, looking up and beaming. "Oh, and he's developing such an appetite. I've never seen him eat like this before. It must be the magic words." "You never know," Mr. Hoppy said darkly. "You never know." Darkly, well. Mr. Hoppy waited 7 whole days before he made his next move. On the afternoon of the 7th day, when Mrs. Silver was at work, he lifted tortoise number 2 from the balcony below and brought it into his living room. Number 2 had weighed exactly 15 ounces. He must now find one that weighed exactly 17 ounces, 2 ounces more. Honestly, with all the eating that one's doing, I'm sure it's already like 17 ounces. From his enormous collection, he easily found a 17-ounce tortoise, and once again he made sure the shells matched in color. Then he lowered tortoise number 3 onto Mrs. Silver's balcony. As you all have guessed by now, Mr. Hoppy's secret was a very simple one. If a creature grows slowly enough, I mean very, very slowly indeed, then you'll never notice that it has grown at all, especially if you see it every day. It's the same with children. They are actually growing taller every week, but their mothers never notice it until they grow out of the clothes. Slowly does it, Mr. Hoppy told himself. Don't hurry. So this is how things went on over the next 8 weeks. In the beginning, Elfie, weight 3 ounces. End of the first week. Tortoise number 2, weight 15 ounces. End of second week. Tortoise number 3, weight 17 ounces. End of third week. Tortoise number 4, weighing 19 ounces. End of fourth week. Tortoise number 5, weight 21 ounces. End of fifth week. Tortoise number 6, weight 23 ounces. I keep forgetting showing you the pictures. And this is just all the tortoises. End of 6th week, tortoise number 7, weight 25 ounces. End of 7th week, tortoise number 8, weight 27 ounces. Elfie's weight was 13 ounces, tortoise number 8 was 27 ounces. Very slowly, over 7 weeks, Mrs. Silver's pet had more than doubled its size, and the good lady hadn't noticed a thing. Even to Mr. Hoppy, peering down over his railing, tortoise number 8 looked pretty big. It was amazing that Mrs. Silver had hardly noticed anything at all during the great operation. Only once she had looked up and said, "You know, Mr. Hoppy, I do believe he's getting bigger. What do you think?" "I can't see a lot of difference myself," Mr. Hoppy had answered casually. But now perhaps it was time to call a halt, and that evening Mr. Hoppy had just about Mr. Hoppy was just about to go out and suggest to Mrs. Silver that she ought to weigh Elfie when a startled cry came from the balcony below and brought him outside. Fast. "Look," Mrs. Silver said. "Elfie's too big to go through the door in his little house. He must have grown enormously." "Weigh him," Mr. Hoppy ordered. "Take him in and weigh him quick." Mrs. Silver did just that, and in half a minute she was back holding the tortoise in both hands and waving it above her head and shouting, "Guess what, Mr. Hoppy? Guess what? He weighs 27 ounces. He's twice as big as he was before." "Oh, you darling," she cried, stroking the tortoise. "Oh, you great, big, wonderful boy. Just look at what clever Mr. Hoppy has done for you." Mr. Hoppy suddenly felt very brave. "Mrs. Silver," he said, "do you think I could pop down to your balcony and hold Elfie myself?" "Why, of course you can," Mrs. Silver cried. "Come down at once." Mr. Hoppy rushed down the stairs, and Mrs. Silver opened the door for him. Together they went out onto the balcony. "Just look at him," Mrs. Silver said proudly. "Isn't he grand?" "He's very big, good-sized tortoise now, He's a big, good-sized tortoise now," Mr. Hoppy said. "And you did it," Mrs. Silver cried. "You're a milkman, you are indeed." But what am I going to do about his house?" Mrs. Silver said. "He must have a house to go into at night, but now he can't get through the door." They were standing on the balcony looking at the tortoise, who was now trying to push his way into his house, but he was too big. "I shall have to enlarge the door," Mrs. Silver said. "Don't do that," Mr. Hoppy said. You mustn't go on chopping up such a pretty little house. After all he needs to be just a tiny bit smaller, and he can get in it easily." "How can he possibly get smaller?" Mrs. Silver said. "That's simple," Mr. Hoppy said. "Change the magic words. Instead of telling him to get bigger and bigger, tell him to get a bit smaller. But in tortoise language, of course." "Will it work?" "Of course it will work. Tell me exactly what I have to say, Mr. Hoppy." Here's the picture of last page. Here's what we're on now. Mr. Hoppy got out a piece of paper and a pencil and wrote, Esio Trot, teg a tib relums. A tib relums. "That'll do it, Mrs. Silver," he said, handing her the paper. "I don't mind trying it, Mrs. Silver, but look here, I wouldn't want him to get titchy small all over again, Mr. Hoppy." "He won't, dear lady, he won't," Mr. Hoppy said. Say it only tonight and tomorrow morning, and then you'll see what happens. We might be lucky." "If it works," Miss Silver said, touching him softly on the arm, "then you're the cleverest man alive." The next afternoon, as soon as Mrs. Silver had gone to work, Mr. Hoppy lifted the tortoises up to her balcony and carried it outside. Mr. Hoppy lifted the tortoise up from her balcony and carried it inside. All he had to do now was find one that was just a shade smaller, so that it would go just through the door of the little house. He chose one and lowered it down with his tortoise catcher. Then, still gripping the tortoise, he tested it to see if it would go through the door. It wouldn't. He chose another. Again he tested it. This one went through nicely. Good. He placed the tortoise in the middle of the balcony beside a nice piece of lettuce and went inside to wait Mrs. Silver's homecoming. I hope it's the same shell, though. Remember how he's been so careful to do the same shell? Alright. That evening, Mr. Hoppy was watering his plants on the balcony when suddenly he heard Mrs. Silver's shouts from below, shrill with excitement. Mr. Hoppy, where are you?" she was shouting. "Look at this." Mr. Hoppy popped his head over the railing and said, "What's up?" "Oh, Mr. Hoppy, it worked," she was crying. "Your magic words have worked again on Elfie. He can now get through the door of his little house. It's a miracle." "Can I come down and look?" Mr. Hoppy shouted. "Come down at once, my dear man," Mrs. Silver answered. "Come down and see my wonders, the wonders you have worked upon my darling Elfie." Mr. Hoppy turned and ran from the balcony into the living room, jumping on tiptoe like a ballet dancer between the sea of tortoises that covered the floor. He flung open his front door and flew down the stairs 2 at a time with the love songs of thousands of cupids ringing in his ears. "This is it," he whispered to himself under his breath. "The greatest moment of my life is coming up now. I mustn't bish it. I mustn't bosh it. I must keep very calm." When he was 3/4 way down the stairs, he caught the sight of Mrs. Silver already standing at the open door waiting to welcome him, with a huge smile on her face. She flung her arms around him and cried out, "You really are the most wonderful man I've ever met. You can do anything. Come in at once and let me make you a cup of tea. That's the very least you deserve." Seated in the comfortable armchair of Mrs. Silver's parlor, sipping his tea, Mr. Hoppy was all of a twitter. He looked at the lovely lady sitting opposite him and smiled at her. She smiled right back at him. I think this is creative to have him look like he's running down the stairs. That smile of hers, so warm and friendly, suddenly gave him the courage he needed, and he said, "Mrs. Silver, will you marry me?" "Why, Mr. Hoppy," she cried, "I didn't think you'd ever get around to asking me. Of course I'll marry you." That was sudden. Mr. Hoppy got rid of his teacup, and the two of them stood up and embraced warmly in the middle of the room. "It's all due to Elfie," Mrs. Silver said, slightly breathless. "Good old Elfie," Mr. Hoppy said. "We'll keep him forever." The next afternoon, Mr. Hoppy took all of his other tortoises back to the pet shops and said they could have them for nothing. Then he cleaned up his living room, leaving not a leaf of cabbage nor trace of tortoise. This is them hugging. Oh, her flip-flop is flying off right there. And that perfect stance, that little foot up, A few weeks later, Mrs. Silver became Mrs. Hoppy, and the two of them lived very happily ever after. That's the picture. Wait, she doesn't even have her original Elfie. Oh, P.S. I expect you are wondering what happened to little Elfie, the first of them all. Well, he was bought a week later from one of the pet shops by a small girl named Roberta Squibb, and he settled down in Roberta's garden. Every day she fed him lettuce and tomato slices and crispy celery, and in the winters he hibernated in a box of dried leaves in a tool shed. That was a long time ago. Roberta has grown up and is now married and has 2 children of her own. She lives in another house, but Elfie is still with her, still the much-loved family pet, and Roberta reckons that by now he must be at least 30 years old. It has taken him all that time to grow twice the size he was when Mrs. Silver had him, but he made it in the end. Oh. He's twice the size now, so the lady just needed to be patient, I guess, and wait for him to grow up. But by the way, that is the end of Esio Trot, which is just tortoise. It's backwards, so yeah, it's just tortoise. So like, put all of those together. But that was a good book, and that's crazy that just happened. That marriage really happened really fast, and all they had to do, that's going to be an interesting conversation when she's like, so, like, how did you really do it? Like, get down into it, and then it's like, I got rid of your original turtle that you had for 11 years that you love, So, that stinks. But that happened, and just 20 years later, he was twice the size. All she needed to be was a little more patient. So yeah, that was the end. So thanks for joining me for Esio Trot, Roald Dahl's book. And this was part 2 of 2. So bye for now.